Wow, that's rather intimidating. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming along. I have a sort of a slight croak, I think, combination of nerves, and I've been talking all day. But I would also like to acknowledge the beautiful Aboriginal land we are on, and acknowledge the work of Aboriginal colleagues who have had a huge impact on my understanding of country and our past. Kev O'Brien, Dylan Comber-Mary and Alison Page, who are kind of fierce, generous, indomitable founders of Merrimah Aboriginal Design Unit within the Government Architect's Office. And their work over the last 30 years has been kind of instrumental in being able to sort of help shape my understanding of the impacts of what we do as architects within the built environment. And then just an opportunity to acknowledge Rachel Perkins, who I don't know, but whose work, the Australia Wars, I think is the most extraordinary piece of communication and information, and it should be in our curriculums across Australia. So that's my support for Rachel. So self-reflection. It's a tough one. You know, as architects, we're just used to talking about and through our buildings all the time. And I've got these words of Joanna Lumley ringing in my ears when she was asked about self-reflection. And she was like, shallow as a puddle. You know, the road's a short one. So I think rather than looking at what's shaped me, what I've sort of thought about more is what has shaped what I think my role as an architect should be. So sorry, that was my image for talking about country. So there's a pool of over 50 years that, you know, I can sort of wade through. And so in looking at that, I've shaped it in regard to looking at my childhood, looking at my architectural education, and looking at buildings that I have met, as well as the impacts of architectural practice. So it was quite fun to actually go through a few old photographs. I was born to Mary and Terry, who were kind of itinerant hippies of the time. There was a lot of hair, a lot of denim, and a lot of corduroy. They were from Perth, although this image, as you could probably tell, is not in Perth. Mum was a nurse and Dad was an architect, and they had worked and travelled their way from country to country during the 60s and the 70s, and they had me along the way. Everything they owned, they could fold up, it could come apart and put in a packing case, and then on it went to the next destination. So I was born in Vancouver in Canada, and we lived there for a little while until Mum and Dad had got itchy feet and were on the move again. And so either with me on their back or on the back of a bike, or we had a lot of combis, we lived and travelled through the UK, through Northern Africa and through Europe. And in looking through some of the old photographs, I found this one, which I particularly like, because those two little sausage dogs that I had on my shoulders were the Olympic mascot from the Munich 1972 Olympics called Voldy. And Dad had worked for a practice working on that particular Olympics, which were just extraordinary in their level of innovation and freshness, from the architecture to the graphic design, and of course to the mascot. Can you imagine having a mascot like that now? If only. So I actually also went to Munich with one of my kids for the 50th anniversary of the Olympics, and you know, the freshness of the buildings and the precinct and the landscape, and still the graphics. You know, this was the birth of the pictogram at that time. We're still as new as they were 50 years ago. But we emigrated back to Canada, and home sickness ended up hitting my mum. So it was back to Perth when I was school age, and the land of the endless beach. And my daughter just arrived in Perth yesterday and is on the beach in 38-degree heat. So my two little brothers came along, Amos and Ash. I kind of figured that I was an only child for a fair period of time, and I think our childhood could be described as pretty happy, you know, uncomplicated and fairly modest. You know, we had what we needed, and it's what I'd sort of call now kind of gently unconventional by Perth standards. You know, architecture and an awareness of the built environment and design was sort of constant, but quite subconscious, like it wasn't something, you know, I thought, we're different. It was just around us all the time. We had an old house in an inner city suburb, and it was in this constant state of construction. Dad was always building something, and the decisions were made from a design perspective: is can I build it, and can we afford it? There was a lot of art on the walls and a lot of books on the shelves, and there was the classic sort of macrame from Mum on the walls as well. I remember being told about how we ended up having this particular painting on the wall in our living room, which was from John Coburn. And it was when the price of gold was good, and Mum and Dad decided to sell a wedding ring to fund it. And they found that it brought them a lot more joy than a wedding ring, so it was a good purchase. And I think it brought us all an enormous amount of joy. It was just such a sort of a lively, beautiful and fresh image. So it wasn't until I got to high school and I met friends who lived in these very established waterfront suburbs in these sort of big, quite dark houses. They were all fairly formal. Some of them weren't very welcoming, that I realised that we were slightly different. No one else had lime green Pirelli on the floors in their kitchen, or mezzanines built in their bedrooms to sort of maximise space. And these sort of informal spaces that felt like you were outdoors as well as indoors. They were much more kind of contained and controlled. I have to say, though, I was in complete envy of friends who had wool Berber carpet, because we had that horrible Koya coconut husk matting, and we just had, imprints all over our legs all the time. But living in Perth meant we could, and we were in the city, we could walk to the shops. We had Kings Park, which is this extraordinary natural landscape at the end of our street, a bushland in the heart of the city. The university and its beautiful gardens were also at the end of the street, and of course we had the ocean. And so there was this wonderful freeness and safety. As kids we owned the street. We sort of roller skated around for hours on end. So I grew up really blessed with access and thought it was absolutely standard, great access to beautiful parks, public open space, tree-lined streets and accessible riverfronts. There was an enormous amount of making that happened in our family. I really quite liked helping Dad when he was doing the inevitable building. I remember this big 2-storey wall frame being built in the back garden, and we had to get neighbours from down the street to come in and help hoist it up with ropes, with Dad standing on the top of the fence. Or there was another time, again, we were building a room out the back, and Dad and I had to lift the timber beam into place, and I had it on one shoulder, and I don't know, I was 13 or something. He had it on the other, and we were both climbing up ladders. Mum was on the ground just completely terrified as we'd having to lift this thing into place. But I suppose it was really a lesson fairly early that design was something that you really had to make work. It was definitely more than just an idea. There was also a lot of sailing on the Swan River, so, bringing in the typical architect sailing stereotype, but I don't think I can fall into the trope of saying I was inspired by the way the hull moved through the water, or all the things that many architects get inspired by in regard to sailing. We sailed a mirror dinghy for absolutely years. It was probably where I learned every swear word I know now from Dad, who was the skipper. But we were often club consistency champions. I can't tell you how many pennants we had on the wall for being consistent. And I wasn't always the happiest forward hand because, sometimes the weather was shit or I had better things to do. But at the time, the rule was you commit, you turn up and you absolutely don't give up. So that's what I took out of sailing. I was also a fairly big reader, and I absolutely loved our local library. And it wasn't just because it housed the books. I really do have very strong recollections of going to this building, which, I kind of acknowledged at that time was quite different from all the old buildings around it. It was sitting within a lovely park, and I quite liked its bold forms. I thought it was, an exciting building to come to. And it also had this gorgeous sort of rough cast render, which was which you can't see in this image, but which gave texture to the sort of strength of the forms. There were a lot of other buildings in my childhood that were certainly spoken a lot about at home. Dad had worked for Ivan Ivanov when he was a student, who was a Bulgarian emigre architect, and he was known for his absolutely beautiful and effortless modernist homes. Dad said that you would document something even with the joinery on one page one sort of A3 page, which was sort of extraordinary. And we have a number of those beautiful drawings in. Well, actually, Dad's a bit of a thrower outer now, so I'm not sure whether they're still around, but I'm sure they're in someone's archive. And we used to drive past a number of these houses. A lot of them were in Floreat Park and City Beach when we went to see my grandparents. Dad often also pointed out the work of Julius Elisha and Geoffrey Summerhayes, more fantastic modern architects in Perth. And then, of course, there was the oeuvre of Le Corbusier on the bookshelves and the case study houses. I remember Craig Elwood being one of Dad's favourite. And lots and lots of books and magazines on post-war housing in medium density, so, pattern book stuff, in Germany and Switzerland. And it was all about solving the problems of housing the booming post-war generations. So then I went to architecture, to study architecture at UWA. I had considered for most of, my time in high school or later high school about studying chemistry. I think I felt like I knew a lot about design, a small kind of K with the new, but it actually sort of was almost intimidating and quite scary, like I knew too much. Anyway, I ended up there, and an enduring early lesson in architecture, thinking about some of the things that impact you in education, was about awareness of what was around you. And we had a lecturer called Ralph Drexel, where we had a project where you had to measure a building with your body, your hand, your stride, your reach, etc., and then use those measurements to draw it up. So architecture students were either out surveying the oak lawn, why we needed to learn to survey, I don't know, or pressing their bodies against buildings. So we were sort of fairly well, stood out in the university campus. But I suppose the point is the power of noticing space and analysing space has certainly not left me. Another really big influence was the architecture of the campus. So, the previous image I showed you was sort of stately, dignified buildings, limestone, gorgeous colonnades, beautiful gardens. But in addition to all of those old buildings, Gus Ferguson, architect, had added a whole lot of new faculty buildings. And I, again, really clearly remember those faculty buildings as being very modern. They were incredibly robust, a lot of off-form concrete. They were really respectful, they were quiet and thoughtful, and they carefully considered their context. They thought about the history, they thought about the climate, but they definitely found their own space. And it was also when I began to notice a series of public buildings that had quite a determining impact on shaping the character of Perth as a city. Howlett and Bailey's competition-winning Council House, very stately and modern with those beautiful concrete T-beams. Its neighbour, the Perth Concert Hall, another Howlett and Bailey project, and it's kind of strong and muscular. And I suppose what really struck me about this building was how confident it seemed to be and how confident the architects appeared with all the decisions they had made. But one of the most memorable buildings that wasn't in Perth for me was something I visited 30 years ago with David, my now husband. And it was Louis Kahn's Institute of Management in Ahmedabad. And we had arrived, hot and flustered from those sort of dirty, polluted, incredibly kind of chaotic streets of Ahmedabad, which is a textile city. And you get to this building and it was the large, cool and incredibly kind of shaded spaces that absolutely captivated us. It was that relentless use of a very soft clay brick. It was the modulation of light. It responded so beautifully to place and to climate and to tradition, and it was just masterful in the way that it handled all those things, and at the same time very, very respectful. So it was a joy to be in. There was another really memorable building from this particular trip, whose work which I won't show, and it was in the UK. It was an architect whose work I absolutely loved. I'd pored over images and plans in magazines and journals, but I had never seen anything in person. And I was seduced, and then the reality was just so disappointing. It had focused so much on its own beautiful form that it had forgotten the context around it. The entry was hard to find. The materials used had weathered incredibly badly, even though it was actually not very old. So that was a really important lesson for me, beware the power of the image and employ our kind of inner critic, even in the face of sort of stardom. And I think this has become even more critical, not just for me, but for all of us, as we are bombarded with architectural imagery in a way that we certainly weren't 30 years ago. And it's becoming easier to sort of trivialise the image and what we see in it rather than looking at a much deeper and important analysis. And I think the other learning is we learn from returning, and returning to our buildings can actually be quite confronting. Back on family, I now have a grown-up family of my own, although the bushy-haired one at the back is not one of ours. He was one of the boyfriends, but it's the most recent one I could find of us all together. And I tell you, if anything was to influence what I think my role as an architect should be, it's being responsible for future generations. So I'll just say that I'm a crier. I cry at absolutely anything. Take me to a school assembly back in the day and I'd cry. I'd cry if they won a soccer game. I was a complete mess. So to save you from tearing up, and my son, I think, is somewhere here, and he's just going to be like, oh my God, Mum, don't. He would be completely mortified. So I'm not going to talk about the kids other than to say they're wonderful human beings. But I could probably talk about David without tearing up. He's the family rock. And, I'm more the kind of paper and the scissors. He's razor sharp and terrifyingly honest and never ever accepting of the status quo, which can be really quite exhausting. But he's also responsible for taking me to some pretty extraordinary places that would never have been on my list or sort of awareness. And one was making our way through a really searing Belgian summer to get to Rozenburg Abbey. And that was the work of Dutch Benedictine monk and architect Dom van Hansdelaan. And it was just so expressive in its sort of quietness and this incredible kind of rhythmic modularity and in its material and the modesty of its detail. And of course, another one, it was cool on a hot day. Then there's the lessons I've learnt through architectural practice that have had a really big influence again on what I think my role as an architect should be. My colleague James Gross is a master at communicating with non-architects, and I've learnt an enormous amount from him. And in preparing for this, I'd listened to a number of other architects speak, and Elizabeth Diller spoke about the fact that 99% of her work, or our work as architects, is about communicating and negotiating, and 1% is the designing and the drawing. And she said, but actually that 99% is as creative and needs to be as creative as the 1% that we spend. And I think, as architects, we develop our own inaccessible language, and we've got to be better at speaking to clients and speak the language of our clients who aren't architects if we want to be able to get our ideas, which we clearly think are important, realised. And being in a position now where I listen to architects talk so much about their work and present their ideas, it's been sort of a real lesson to me about how much work I have to do to be able to communicate the value of what we do, because I speak most of my time to non-architects, to politicians, to fellow bureaucrats, etc. And we've got to bring people into our tent. We can't keep them on the outside through this foreign language that we develop. We also put an enormous emphasis on expertise, and experts, I think, are vitally important, but so are those who don't have specific expertise but still think really critically. And innovation and change come from, not being able to challenge the norms, but ask why. Not being afraid to challenge the norms, but asking why in projects. And we can actually come quite complacent as experts. And I certainly saw this happening at BVN, where we saw the power of the expert, where we would bring people into teams who didn't have expertise in that particular project type, be it a hospital, a defence building, education, whatever that might have been, and giving them the freedom to sort of untangle the ropes themselves and to come at a project with a really different position, enabled us to have a fresh way of thinking about projects we'd been thinking about in the same way for a very long time. We all also love to work on projects with design-educated clients, museums, lovely houses, office buildings, private schools, universities. But there are so many projects out there, and let me tell you, I see so many of them, that don't have design-driven clients. Their budgets are often really tight, their briefs are quite unimaginative, and their design expectations can often be quite low as well. Public hospitals, defence buildings, infrastructure buildings associated with all of our transport connections, public housing, aged care. They're really hard and they're actually quite exhausting, and they probably won't get us onto the pages of AA or Design, but they really, really matter, and they need us as architects. They need our critical thinking, they need our ability to problem solve, and they need our care for people and the public, and they need our care for the climate and for the future. And sometimes it's really small moves that actually end up making a big difference. This is a hospital I went to see by White Architecture in Stockholm, Karolinska, and they had made this move of pulling the entire hospital to the street frontage and lining the front of it with a series of shops. So the entry to the hospital, rather than sort of standing out on its own, ended up being a number of them embedded into this series of shops. Now, that didn't mean that all the mess of services entries, emergency entries, etc., weren't around the edges. So, it wasn't what you would call a perfect building, but the impact this small move made was just so significant in bringing a hospital into the life of a community in a way that it wouldn't have already. I think also we have this need to give attribution in architecture to a single genius. It's just sort of one point, and in doing so we dangerously oversimplify the creative process that we work through. Too often architecture is seen as a solo endeavour, when it's actually an act of this extraordinary community participation. Brian Eno coined this term senius, which I'll just read out here because I can't remember it, the intelligence of a whole, of an operation or group of people. So it's suggesting this sort of ecology of talent and ideas that create a quality of work that comes from well beyond the single person. So the friction between collaborators is what creates something amazing. Our work is also not for architects, and I recall reading in 1998 an article in AD Consuming Architecture that talked about the fact that acceptance by peers is more important to architects than public approval. And, it's super hard because we're each other's fiercest critics, absolutely, but it's such an important check to have to say, what am I doing this for? And at GA, we created a vision for our organisation that design is everybody's business. I visited a building in 2018 that was an absolute aha moment for me. I was doing a lot of work in Hong Kong with the government there on their health and research buildings and portfolio, and we went to this major hospital in Singapore called Khoo Teck Puat. And it was extraordinary. A hospital in a garden in a hospital is what the CEO had described the vision as, and it challenged so many conventions in health architecture. Perceived comfort, infection control, efficient use of area, cross-ventilated spaces. I mean, you could go on. And we often say, but why, when we get sort of encountered with so many of the different elements of a hospital brief, and the questions are, the response is, but there's a code, there's a risk matrix. And this hospital was really a beautiful experience, and clearly the architects, who are RMJM and CPG, had done this fantastic job. They're incredibly clever. They must have had an amazing consultant team working with them to support it. But I think what really struck me is this project had a very, very long life well before those architects got into the room. There was somebody who had a vision, who fought and drove for a business case. They found, they would have fought battles to get funding for this. They drove changes to codes and to standards, and they must have made some pretty big decisions on that risk matrix to say, we're ready to take them on, because they believed that there was definitely a better way of doing something, and they had the courage to fight for it. So this building is actually the reason that when I got a phone call about the government architect role, and it was certainly not on my radar, it wasn't something I'd even considered, I did think twice, because this was an opportunity to have an influence on a project in the back room or in the front room, depending on how you look at it. So while practicing, I was an invisible architect doing quite visible work. And now I'd consider myself quite a visible architect doing fairly invisible work. And, I think I'm okay with that.
You have mentioned a few things that resonated with me. Now that you're saying about you're doing invisible work, and you're fine with that, I wonder, what do you think is the biggest misconception about architecture? Because you were feeling like fulfilled in your role, maybe even more than before, which was a great role as well. Is there any kind of misconception about?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of misconceptions about what it is to, succeed as an architect. And a lot of that is about public recognition. And, as I said, we oversimplify the creative process and it's easy. And I think the public like to see who was the person, who was responsible for this. And because it's easy, we're not good at being able to describe the broader impacts and how many people are actually involved. But I think to, getting an understanding, and if we've got to sort of put that to one side, and there are the number of buildings in magazines and admired by peers are very, very small in percentage to the amount that is delivered and creates the societies that we live in. And so I think we've got to have a different way of valuing the work that we do.
And when you saw that kind of examples to other people and say maybe this is a good way to do something here in our region, what's the typical excuse or typical way to say no, that will not work here?
Yeah, you get a lot of that won't work. Sometimes there's desperation's not quite the right word, but you get to a point of crisis, and I'd say the housing crisis is sort of a good example of where everyone's looking for an opportunity to do something differently, because it's like we haven't been able to make it work, so what can we do? And it's where you find those little moments where you can see the weakness, where there's an ability to then use that as an opening to try and propose change. And other times you just have to keep on working at it, and you're like, oh my God, this is the 10th time this person has spoken to me about that. Would you shut up? Okay. So that's the kind of perseverance thing. Yeah.
And was there's something that that you didn't know and you learned when you changed your role to a government architect, because you had like 25 or 30 years experience as an architect in practice? And was there something that surprised you?
How long that project duration is. Like when I sort of spoke about Kutek Pot as my aha moment, I thought there was a long life in front of it, but I didn't realise how long. And there was a colleague from Metro who is an architect working within the Metro teams, delivering all the extraordinary infrastructure across New South Wales for the Metros. And, he sort of said that baton just gets passed from team to team to team to team, whether it be developing a business case, whether it be developing a reference scheme, whether it be working on a managing contractor bid, finally to the ones that ended up getting selected as the final architects to do the work. And they are years down the track. And you see that when you're in that back room or front room in a way that you're just not aware of in the private sector.
How to keep the enthusiasm during the whole long process and all the stages to make sure that at the end there's a final good product, good architecture. How to keep that?
Well, there's always going to be people that move through it, but I think if any project is armed with a really strong vision that's believable, you end up having people buy into that. It's where you know that something's got hairs on it and you're like, oh God, I'm working on this, but it's not great. You can see project teams really struggle. Whereas if there's strength to it, and everyone can buy into that vision, doesn't matter, you might change a few things along the way, but the vision and the sort of strategy of the project doesn't change. And I think that's where you get people owning something.
And what will you be ready to compromise in order to make a project happen? Because there will be some in this process that something will be like could fall apart and someone is not don't agree, but at least to keep it in a way that you consider successful? Is
Oh, I think as architects, and I mean in life, we're just endlessly compromising, and you've got to be thinking, well, what's the alternative? You know, I could sort of fight that, and you lose everything, or you concede on this and you get a bit of that. I mean, that happens in architecture, that happens in policy, that happens in relationships. You know, so it's sort of weighing up what the alternatives are, so you can inform the decision you make about how hard you fight.
And do you apply that in private life as well?
Yeah, I do, absolutely.
And that's
You
the
pick your
work.
battles, Herman.
Thank you.
Definitely.
You mentioned one of the first things that you mentioned was that your role is being responsible for future generations. As last question, I wanted to ask you, what is your hope for future generations?
I hope that the future generations have hope. I think we need to be able to show that there's an opportunity for change and there's an opportunity for a future, rather than giving the current sort of youth that we are responsible for a sense of hopelessness. And you can see a lot of that hopelessness happening, and that sort of despondent, and that's the last position you want anyone to be in. So I think we've got to find a way to show that there's hope and opportunity.
Sometimes difficult when you see the
I know,
news
I
and
know,
you see what's happening in
I
the
know,
world. It's like,
I know.
okay,
It is.
can't believe that this is happening.
Yeah. And then you find the really good people out there and the gems who are doing amazing stuff, and you've got to
true. And
remind yourself about
how
them.
could we give more visibility to those gems that are doing a great job and are being hopeful to be more hopeful? How can we support?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and we should be. We should always be sort of holding up the good. And look, that's certainly what we at the GA try and focus on. You don't want to be out there talking about everything that's done badly. You want to be constantly using examples of where something has been done well, so that it is something to aspire to, rather than say, well, that wasn't great.
That makes sense. Abbie,
Yeah.
thank you for the talk and for the
Great.
interview.
Thank you.
Thank you a lot. We
Thanks,
appreciate it.
Herman.